The reason we're going to start on time is I appreciate that you all came out tonight on a rainy night and decided to sit with us for a couple hours to discuss affordable housing. Once Jamie gets seated, I'll start. And we're going to record this session so we can put it up for land use commissioners and others interested who might not have the opportunity to attend it tonight. My name is Jim Butler, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments, whose building you are in. We represent 20 municipalities here in Southeastern Connecticut. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Southeastern Connecticut Housing Alliance, and I'd like to introduce Norton Wheeler, SECHA's chairman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're excited to have you here, and we're also excited to have such a great panel here to discuss kind of the pros and cons of 830G in home Connecticut, and there'll be plenty of time to talk and discuss it afterwards. There'll be a question and answer period, so I look forward to having your participation tonight as well as your being here. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to briefly introduce the other SECHA members that are in the room. John Bolduc from the Eastern Connecticut Association of Realtors, Mark Offender, the Groton Town Manager, and Terry O'Rourke from the Habitat for Humanity. Bob Vasari from SECHA is a member of the panel, and I'm going to give you a more detailed introduction right now. So our first panelist is to my right. David Fink is the Policy Director for the Partnership for Strong Communities, a nonprofit which works on solutions to end homelessness, develop healthy neighborhoods, and create more affordable housing opportunities for workers, young professionals, and families. In his role there, David serves as the Staff Director of the Home Connecticut campaign. He also coordinates education and advocacy efforts that relate to housing education, transportation, energy, and health care. To his right is attorney Mike Ziska, who is with the firm Murtha Kalina. He has represented numerous municipalities, businesses, and individuals in all phases of land use and environmental permitting, compliance, and litigation. His land use practice encompasses zoning, planning, subdivisions, inland and coastal wetlands, public sewer and water development, and the drafting and amendment of regulations and ordinances. Prior to practicing law, Mr. Ziska served as a hydrogeologist for the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. To Mr. Ziska's right is attorney Tim Hollister from the firm Shipman and Goodwin in its Hartford office. His practice focuses on land use, environmental, and municipal law. His work on affordable housing includes litigating the landmark Builder Service Corporation case in 1988, which was before the Connecticut Supreme Court, and which laid the groundwork for the passage of Section 830G, the statute, one of the statutes we're talking about tonight. He worked with the original Blue Ribbon Commission in 1988-89 in drafting 830G, and he served on the second Blue Ribbon Commission in 1999 when that statute was revised to make it more user-friendly for municipalities. And he drafted the 830 state regulations in 2002, and he's assisted the Partnership for Strong Communities in drafting the Home Connecticut State Statute in 2007. Next is Mr. Bob Vasari, the President of Real Estate Service of Connecticut, a company he co-founded in 1978, and Mr. Vasari is also a member of the SECHA's Board of Directors. Over the last 60 years, Mr. Vasari has developed and built thousands of residential dwellings. His company recently built a 108-unit affordable condominium project in Niantic under 830G, and he was a member of the Hope Partnership when it built the 16-unit ferry crossing in Old Saybrook, the state's first project built in an incentive housing zone. And last but not least, on the far left, your far left, is Jamie Rabbit, who is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, who has worked as a professional planner for the past 26 years. He currently is a senior planner here at the Council of Governments, where he has been employed since 1996. His primary responsibilities at the SCCOG are land use planning and transportation, and he is assigned to the town of Lisbon as their town planner. So, tonight, I'd ask you to bear with me, I guess, and to agree that the need for more affordable housing in Connecticut in our region is a given. That topic is not the subject of tonight's discussion or debate. Rather, we want our expert panel to discuss the merits and drawbacks of Connecticut's two principal laws that are intended to foster the provision of affordable housing. The Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Statute, CGS 8-30G, and the Housing for Economic Growth or Home Connecticut program, which is codified under Section 8-13 of the state statutes. In 2012, there were only 3 municipalities in southeastern Connecticut, Groton, New London, and Norwich, that were exempt from an appeal under CGS 8-30G due to the fact that they exceeded the minimum requirement of 10% affordable units as defined by that statute. In fact, of Connecticut's 169 cities and towns, only 31 municipalities had 10 or more % of their units considered affordable. Towns in southeastern Connecticut range from a low of 0.96% of their housing stock being affordable, I won't name that town, to a high of 20.39% in Groton. The average of the towns in southeastern Connecticut not hitting that 10% mark was only 3.65% of their collective units being considered affordable. Just prior to this, we were meeting and having a slice of pizza together, and I asked Attorney Hollister about the number of units that 830G is responsible for seeing or having been built in Connecticut. And a number that we all agree on is that 2% of the total housing built in the state since 830G was on the books is attributable to 830G. That's still low, only 2%. Under the Home Connecticut program, where incentive housing zones are encouraged in municipalities, only 8 municipalities have had IHZs, or incentive housing zones, approved to date. 5 additional towns have been asked to resubmit their applications to the state and are considering adopting them once the state approves them. To date, only 16 units in Old Saybrook and 12 units in Sharon have been built under this program. So what is wrong with these programs, and why are they not resulting in more affordable housing units? What can be done to fix the statutes, if anything? Why do municipalities fear 830G? Why aren't they using the Home Connecticut program, which pays them money to develop incentive housing zones more frequently? For the answer to these questions, I'm now going to turn it over to our expert panel. So what I'd like to do now, panel, is to invite each of you to take 2 to 3 minutes to make an opening statement. That opening statement could detail an experience you have had, either with the 2 statutes being discussed and how that has influenced your point of view on the subject. Please be reminded that one thing we've all agreed to is that no projects that are under litigation or which may be subject to future litigation will be discussed. I'm gonna start with David, okay? I'm gonna start to my right, and we'll keep working back and forth.
2 to 3 minutes.
Please.
Okay.
You're on the clock.
Okay. I think there are all sorts of reasons why the 2 statutes have not worked as well as we might. We'll get into those tonight. I mean, in short order, 830G projects are difficult to do, and it's difficult for developers to do. I would argue that even though they produced only a certain amount of units, and Tim can give you those, but about 3,000 affordable units, they have encouraged other housing production by the towns because the statute exists. The Home Connecticut program, as you recall or may not recall, was first passed by the legislature in 2007. Planning grants were not funded until April of 2008, and we all know what happened 4 months later in September of 2008. And so the program was on pause, but we've had a great deal of interest in the program, especially of late. And I would argue that even though we have only 9 incentive housing zones and 5 more on the runway ready to take off, we've had several towns use the statute to modify their zoning ordinances to do variations on the theme. So, and you know, there are other reasons we can get into. I don't think towns are ready to do Home Connecticut yet. They're not used to it. It's a proactive way of creating housing as opposed to a reactive way. But we can get into all of that, and I think I probably used up my 2
No, you gave Mr. Zisker a few extra minutes. Go ahead, Mike.
I won't take those minutes. I have, although I've represented developers, landowners, and municipalities, the vast amount of my practice has been for municipalities. I've probably represented almost half of the municipalities in some fashion in the state at one time or another. And so my perspective is likely to be quite different from those of David and Tim and Bob. Although I certainly have no problem with incentive programs, and my comments tonight are not going to be related that much to the Home Connecticut program, because frankly my experience has not been to date so much with that. My focus will be more on the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. And again, although as Jim said, I agree, as I think everybody does, with the concept that we need to do something in Connecticut to make sure more people, more of our residents, more of our potential residents have an opportunity to purchase and stay in a home in Connecticut. I view the Affordable Housing Appeals Act as a seriously flawed way of accomplishing that goal. I don't mean to say that it hasn't had some benefits in some areas, and certainly as Attorney Hollister will undoubtedly point out and has in his materials, there are a number of quite a few affordable units that have been developed as a result of the program. However, in my view, the drawbacks of the Affordable Housing Appeals Act outweigh its benefits for a number of reasons that I expect to be able to get into in more detail later tonight.
Well, by way of introduction, let me just mention the two materials that I brought with me tonight, which I think we'll get into and will help you. The first is John Bolduc will recognize, because I prepared it for his a seminar at his office last year, and it compares 830G with Home Connecticut. But the other one, it says at the top, Connecticut General Assembly Housing Committee. If I were going to take issue with the claim that 830G has not worked, this is what I would give you as information. It talks about the housing production. It talks about the changes that have been made over the years to make the statute more palatable to municipalities, and it sort of goes through the litany of claims about 830G's deficiencies that are brought to the legislature every year and debated, and I think mostly, after they're raised, in some way or form put to bed. 2% is the number that Jim correctly threw out, but that's about 12,000 units, and I will tell you that one thing I've learned over the years is that all housing, but especially affordable housing, is built one unit at a time, and it serves one family at a time. And even we can say that 2% or 12,000 units is not much over a 25-year period, or we can think about 12,000 families that have a housing opportunity they would not otherwise have had. We can talk about the economic benefits of those 12,000 units. So, there's always two ways to look at it. But by way of introduction, I just want to give you a quick tongue-in-cheek kind of approach. Over the years, this is a pattern I have seen in municipalities over and over again, and I call it the cycle. And it starts with the affordable housing application, and then it goes to the angry public hearing where people are angry about change, and chairs get thrown, and tomatoes get launched at the presenters, and so forth. And then there's the denial, and then there's the court appeal, and then there's the court decision saying, well, there isn't really anything wrong with this, so we're going to order it approved. And then there's a construction, and then there's the occupancy, and then there's the final phase. And again, this is tongue-in-cheek. The final phase is where the municipal officials cite the development as evidence of their commitment to affordable housing. So my point is, everybody, change is hard. Building stuff, whether it's housing or anything, involves backhoes and dirt and mud and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, and I think David has seen this almost as much as I have, at the end of the day, we get housing that is needed, and I defy anybody to show me a housing development under 830G that's an eyesore or a detriment to the community. So the point is, I've seen over and over again, we get to the end and everybody says, what was the fight all about? Please keep that in mind.
Well, I'm the senior guy here, who's been in this
By a considerable margin.
This mud and dust and all the other things that you talked about. And I remember the day, and I don't mean to be reminiscing here, but I remember the day when we built affordable housing, we used to call it that. And I see some people in the room here who probably moved into that affordable housing, which is the house. Maybe something I built. I did a lot of work in Southeastern Connecticut and throughout central Connecticut itself. But we didn't call it affordable housing, it was just housing for people who needed a house and could afford to buy it, who had a regular job, they weren't wealthy, they didn't come from wealthy families, they probably got an FHA loan like I did when I bought my first house, 3% down, borrowed the money for that 3% and swore on a Bible that you didn't borrow it, because that was the only way you could make it happen. And I got to tell you, everybody in my neighborhood did exactly that same thing. And we all had a great life. We had a great neighborhood. And maybe a few years later, we sold that house and moved up to something a little bit bigger if our station in life moved up a little bit. Or maybe now that we're getting older, we move back into those kinds of things. And we didn't call it 830G. We didn't call it incentive housing. We called it housing. Can't do it today. I'm a builder, and that's the hardest thing in the world to do, even if I don't call it affordable housing. Because we're just not allowed to do it. There's always a reason to turn it down, if that's what you want to do. If you, I don't know if there's any commission members here tonight, but if I was on a planning or zoning commission, and I had 50 people outside the door that didn't want that project, and I had 3, the proponent, his attorney, and his traffic consultant, who wanted it, who am I going to play to as a commissioner? Yes, I'm going to follow the rules, but if there's any way to turn it down, that's what I have to do to satisfy them. The first job of getting affordable housing is to change the attitude of the public. With all due respect, you can write all the regulations and all the incentives you want. I've been involved with both of them. I built a project in Niantic that's under 830G, a so-called friendly 830G. The town wanted it, but they wanted it because there was a group of people in the public that wanted it. And when it came to a public hearing, they stood up and supported that. And the naysayers sat in their hands because they would have been embarrassed to say the things that they would normally say at a public hearing when there is no one else except the proponent talking about the other side. So I would say to you, whichever way you want to go, including neither of these two systems, if you want affordable housing in your community, you've got to get the people in your community to support it. A lot of good reasons. That's what made the Hope Project and Old Saybrook work. If incentive housing, even though it was built under the incentive housing zone legislation, if that was not there, it would have still been built. It would have still been built. It would have, any zoning commission can do on its own what the incentive housing zone does. There's no requirement that you have to have legislation to do it. They could write that without the legislation. And it happened to come along simultaneous with the Hope Project. And they said, oh my gosh, we can get some money from the state of Connecticut if we call it, and then they went through that process. They didn't get everything they were supposed to get, but they did get some dollars. But that project would still be built because the whole partnership did its job of getting the public to understand what we were talking about. It wasn't a sales job, it was an education job. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. Dave?
Not an attorney, just a planner, classically trained, and spend most of my career representing municipalities as their town planner. I've done some work in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island on the private sector side. But most of my perspective is sitting on the same side of the table as the commission member, who have always laid out this very prestigious, detailed planning process where state statute allows you to formulate a planning commission or a planning and zoning commission or a zoning commission. State statute then tells you once you have one of those commissions, you can create a set of regulations. Most towns typically do that by dividing the towns into certain land use categories, whether it's R10 or 10,000 square foot zone or up to R80 or in some cases up to 3 acres. But there's a process to all of that. That process is also predicated on a requirement that state statute tells you have to have a plan of conservation and development if you have a planning commission. And you're now going to be penalized potentially from a financial standpoint if you don't update your plan of conservation every 10 years. So they're used to this methodic way of planning over time. You do your plan of conservation and development. Your zoning regulations are a way to articulate your goals and objectives of the plan. And the development process is laid out in viewpoint of most commission members relatively simple. You write a set of regulations, someone applies under that set of regulations, and you, if you meet them, all commissions should approve your application. And you weigh every application against a set of criteria. I want to say in Connecticut right now, there's kind of one exception to that, and that's the 830G exception, where there seems to be uncertainty. I think Bob made a couple good points in his opening remarks about the perception of 830G and maybe the lack of education on the affordable housing aspect, not associated with 830G, but just affordable housing in general. I mean, if I ask people, how many people grew up in a home 800 to 1,200 square feet? Okay. How many people live in a home in excess of 2,400 square feet now? Not too bad. Okay. But, Bob could probably say what he used to build is very different from what he builds now, because things have changed. But, going back to this perception of you submit an application, it either meets a set of regulations or it doesn't. If it does, you should approve it. If it doesn't, most commissions deny it. In some instances, they still try to approve it because they don't want to be a bad guy. But 830G changes that game. It changes the perception. And I think it's difficult for both the commission and from the development standpoint, because it brings into this gray area of uncertainty. And Tim touched upon that too, that developers want to do certain things. But when you do 830G, there's a perception associated with it, and there's uncertainty from both sides. And with that uncertainty, I think in some instances becomes this adversarial relationship that doesn't always need to exist. And I think as we go forward, we can talk a little bit more about that how does 830G work now, and how perhaps could we make 830G work better with some, I don't have, whether they're simple revisions or non-simple revisions, or whether there's something we can add to the incentive housing legislation, which says, I struggle with some commissions sometimes when they ask me about incentive housing zones, and if you create one, you're still susceptible to 830G, not in the zone, but anywhere else in town. So even if you adopt the incentive housing zone on 300 acres that's sewered and watered, someone could still 830G you outside of that 300 acres and go to this uncertainty, deal with the perceptions, and deal with, in some instances, this adversarial relationship that just evolves based on perceptions.
All right, that's a great start. One thing I failed to do at the outset was to notify the audience that we hope to have time at the end of this session for your questions, so please save them up if you can. If you really have to ask a question, jump up and down 3 times and I'll recognize that it's urgent. Just kidding. Let me know if you have an urgent question. You have to stop the panel discussion. But for the next hour or so, I'm going to ask the panelists 4 different questions that I have provided them in advance of this forum. And then we're going to allow them to wrap up with a statement at the end. And I hope that provokes a lot of thought and question on your part. So I'm going to start mixing up the order. I didn't do this scientifically or anything. I'm just trying to bounce it around a little bit so nobody's first and last all the time. So I'm going to start with Tim. Here's your first question, Tim, should you choose to answer it. From your standpoint, what is the most troublesome aspect about, or what is not working with Connecticut's Affordable Housing Land Use Appeal Statute 830G? And we're going to ask the panelists again to take 2 to 3 minutes apiece on these questions. If you need to take longer, let me know.
Well, I think aside from what Bob Fusari quite accurately said about attitudes about affordable housing, which after all is price-restricted housing. You're taking housing units and you're setting them aside at a certain maximum sales price of rent for people who can only afford in that price range. But when 830G was first adopted in 1989, 1990, there were 2 decisions that were made. But by the way, we borrowed most of the structure from Massachusetts, which had this type of a law going back to 1969. One thing that was absolutely off limits was subjecting affordable housing or the advantages of 830G to the wetlands process. And the other one was anything having to do with infrastructure. So what's happened over the 20 plus years that 830G has been in effect is we've had these pitched battles over wetlands and sewer and infrastructure, and, and then we get to the zoning eventually. And so, it's just, it was the legislature's choice. Compare that to Massachusetts, where they have what we call one-stop shopping, or what's known in the Massachusetts law as the comprehensive permit. You go in, you meet with your plan, and a administrative group rules on every aspect, including wetlands and including sewer. And guess what? It's a more streamlined process, and we don't have they don't have court battles that run on quite as long as ours. So if the most troublesome aspect, what I would fix if I ran the zoo is I would go more to the Massachusetts system of one-stop shopping comprehensive permit.
Great. David, what do you see as the most troublesome aspect about 830G?
Well, I'm going to give you two reasons, two aspects. One is that I do think that the law has been used by wise guys to leverage states. And they'll do things like happened in one municipality where a developer bought a 1-acre lot in a single-family zone and said he wanted to put up a triple-decker and make one of the units affordable, and what he was really looking to do was get the town of the neighbors to buy him out. I don't think that's a good use of the statute, and I don't think that developer had any interest in creating affordable housing. And I think, we've seen other vexatious type suits where that's really not the effort. But here's, I think, the real problem with 830G. You can make a law that says that your children have to do their homework, but if you give them no help doing their homework, they're not going to get their homework done. I think we've said with 830G, and I believe in this law, and we can get into that later, that it is in the state's interest that municipalities create housing for all sorts of people in their towns. And I think that's fair, and it's the golden rule. And everyone has to stop and think, don't I need a place to live? And towns have been exclusionary. They want the people who cut their lawns and wax their floors and do all the things in their house to get out of town by 5 o'clock and go home. That's not right. So I think it is in the state's interest, and I think it was defensible for the state to require that of towns. But that's like requiring the homework. Then you have to help the homework to get done. I think we've not helped the towns with the statute to do this. And part of that is we haven't really explained to the towns, for instance, how the moratorium provision works. Towns can create housing, and they can achieve a moratorium from 830G for 4 years. They just have to create some, but they don't do it. We could show them better how to do it. We could show them better how to renew that moratorium for another 4 years by giving them technical assistance. The state could help the towns more. But I think the real problem with the statute is the towns don't really understand how to use the statute. They see it as a club rather than a tool, and it could be a tool if they knew how to use it.
Interesting perspective, because most folks would regard the statute as not being used by the towns, but being used to compel the towns to do something. We'll come back to it. Jamie, from your standpoint, what is the most troublesome aspect of the Connecticut affordable housing and appeals statute?
I'm going to defer for a moment because I asked someone this question the other day, and all kidding aside, they said the problem with 830G is 830G. And I think saying that, I'll go back to the fact that commissions are used to this traditional regulatory framework, and 830G goes outside of that. And it's the very nature of these different rules that typically upset a local land use commission. They're used to, if it's an acre, it's an acre. If it's not a half acre, it's a half acre. If it's 25-foot setback, if it's supposed to be sewer, you have sewer, not an exemption to everything. It's really, there's this 830G floating zone that shifts around the town. The other aspect of that is also this uncertainty that given the nature of the statute coupled with various court decisions, the process in some instances has become confusing commission members. And that was health, safety, public welfare. The need for public housing, for affordable housing, has to outweigh those criteria to protect health, safety, public welfare. But that's a moving target a little bit. In some instances, in Saddle Ridge, it's because someone wanted to protect groundwater for future wellheads. In other areas, it's traffic. In other areas, it's some environmental concern. In others, it's because someone on a plan of conservation and development had that land dedicated for open space. And it's a moving target in some aspects, both for the commission and the applicant. Because in some instances, the applicant doesn't know what's expected of them or how the commission's going to react to their initial proposal. So again, trying to make 830G a little clearer with some type of technical and this is just from the commission's perspective, that it's easy for them to check boxes off. It's hard when you give them a box of crayons to try and determine whether development meets some arbitrary criteria that changes based on the latest cases that people like Mike or Tim may be involved in. It keeps moving. It would, in some aspects, it'd be simpler if 830G said if a town had an underlying zone of 1 acre, that someone could apply in that zone for up to no more than a certain density, given the following criteria. I think it brings more certainty to a development application, and it gives more certainty to a commission on how they're supposed to respond. The other aspect that we keep getting is the way 830G was set up and how municipalities get credit for their 10%. They get credit for government-assisted units, they get credit for the CHFA mortgages, and they get credit for their deed-restricted units. CHFA could disappear tomorrow if someone pays their mortgage off. So that, I wasn't involved in the initial criteria that was set up. Tim may be able to bring some light to this. Government-assisted units, kind of once a government-assisted unit, always a government-assisted unit. But CHFA and then the deed-restricteds are good for 40 years. What happens in 41? So a town has 10% in 2000 and 2040. They may have 0% affordable. So they're going to be susceptible to 830G again. So I don't know if 40 years is a number that can be looked at. Maybe should it be 60? Jim and I had a brief discussion this afternoon about. We don't know what the magic number is, but why is it 40 and not 45? Why is it 40 and not 50? Was it kind of one generation in a house and then that generation moves on? Why is CHFA a criteria when a town could have 60% of their units below the median price of an affordable unit, but they get no credit for that? And I know that could change tomorrow, because the price of a unit is always worth what someone is willing to pay. And that changes on a monthly basis, up or recently down. But I don't have any real answers. I don't think any of us have the golden ticket or the magic bullet this evening to fix everything. But I think, again, it goes back to, how do David and his group and others educate towns? How do we work with the builders to try and figure out exactly what we need to do to make people understand more that its goal is to build housing for our kids who may be just getting out of college, for other families, for the people, for our new planners that we may have on our staff, and others that need housing. And I think no one's mentioned it tonight, but it's not low-income housing. I know we usually say this whenever we're before board. It's affordable housing. It's workforce housing. It's for the Jamie Rabbit starting out for college, or Tim getting out of law school, or someone just trying to make a go with it. It's not low-income. It's not necessarily affordable. It's affordable to someone who's working class. And I think we need to get that message out a little more. I think somehow we need something in place that also helps us do something in the stopgap. 4 years is a nice moratorium, but in year 5, it doesn't help you anymore. So,
Mike, what isn't working from your point of view with 832?
Well, from my standpoint, I'm going to echo a little bit of what Jamie said, but review it in a different way. There are a number of statutes and statutory systems that require towns to take certain steps in planning their future. Obviously, the zoning regulations and comprehensive plan of zoning is one. Towns are required to make sure that their plans of zoning are comprehensive, that they've considered everything, that they've looked at all aspects of a town when they create their zoning scheme. And in fact, if you try to vary from that zoning scheme, if you seek a variance from the zoning scheme, there's an extremely high burden that you have to meet, theoretically, in order to get a variance from that comprehensive plan. There's also a requirement that there be uniformity in districts, that people within district have the same rules applied to them. And if that's not true, if the community creates what's called a spot zone, that spot zone can be overturned by a court for being inconsistent with that principle of uniformity. Under 8-25, we have a system where a community in deciding what rules ought to apply to subdivisions have to think of the overall infrastructure of the town. They have to think where roads are going to be built, how roads are going to be built. They're supposed to make sure that they're part of a comprehensive system of roads. They have to consider water availability and sewer availability, generally where utilities are going and so forth. And today, we're also supposed to be considering smart growth. Where do we locate the densest development so that it can take advantage of the best traffic infrastructure or transportation infrastructure that we have? And basically, all of those go out the window with the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, because under the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, a developer can pick any place in town and turn it into a very dense development under the Affordable Housing Act. If there's one thing that's clear under the case law, is that the density, the overall lot size, doesn't matter. That's never going to be a reason to turn down an affordable housing plan, lot size. And so we're requiring towns to do all of these things comprehensively, to look at the entire picture, and yet when it comes to affordable housing, we're telling these very same towns, don't worry about it. Doesn't matter anymore. Absolutely doesn't matter. And I think what Jamie was saying is, when, as a town, we've been through decades and decades of a system whereby we were supposed to be deciding what's best for our communities and figuring out the best places for things to happen. All of a sudden, communities now are at the mercy of any particular landowner who can force a type of development that the community thinks is in the wrong place down their throats. Because as the Affordable Housing Act and as Tim has pointed out, now you have to meet a public health and safety standard. That's the only thing that will allow you to say no to an affordable housing development. I think that's just flat wrong. I just think that's inappropriate as a matter of policy. I don't claim to have all of the answers, certainly, and I mean, I'd love to have a long discussion about how we can solve some things like this, but it seems to me that the system ought to be one where the state creates the criteria that, maybe what the state could do is set a group of minimum criteria for different things, such as minimum criteria for lot size, minimum criteria for road standards, minimum criteria for water and sewer, just a variety of minimum criteria, and say in an affordable housing development, these, as long as the developer meets these minimum criteria, that's enough. And then allow the towns to apply other criteria. Also, demand that the towns pick the places where they must allow affordable housing. If we're telling the towns time and again that they have to, the system has been, when you go up on appeal from a zoning or a subdivision decision, the courts have always said, well, it's the municipalities that know best. We don't want to second guess the municipalities because they're closer to the situation and they know best. Yet in an affordable housing situation, you have a single judge who may live nowhere near you, who's telling you what's best for your town, what you have to accept for your town. It seems to me that there ought to be some way for the state, in an affordable housing statute, to say to towns, you must designate specific areas in your town where the state minimum standards for affordable housing will apply, so that everybody knows, if you're going, we want to develop affordable housing, this is where it's going to go in these towns. So developers have the opportunity to go into those areas, acquire those parcels, and develop them under the state minimum standards. And that way, the towns at least have the control over where they think the most logical locations for this type of development is in the town. It makes no sense to me to have a dense affordable housing development occurring in the far reaches of a town when the densest center of the town, where all of the main social services are, is far away. I think of a town like New Milford, the biggest geographical town in the state. And theoretically, you could have a very, very, very dense affordable housing development up on the border of the town of Kent, where the only thing available is Route 7 and maybe not a lot of other types of services, rather than having it clustered around New Milford, where it would make sense from a smart growth perspective. So I think that's one of the biggest problems that I have. It turns the concept of comprehensive planning on its head. It does not allow the municipalities to have control over where they think, from a smart growth standpoint, things should be. And I'm not saying that towns shouldn't be forced to accommodate affordable housing. I think some law requiring towns to make provisions for affordable housing is absolutely necessary for some of the reasons that the courts and Tim and others will say, and Bob has said, because some towns are just going to say no. Some towns will say no all the time. But those are I think that's my biggest concern with the statute. I think it does too much to upset the comprehensive planning apple cart, and I think that has to change.
Bob?
Well, I'm the guy on the ground who has to deal with all of the factors. I'm the guy on the other side of the table at the Planning and Zoning Commissions, not just for affordable housing, but for virtually anything I want to develop in town. And the reality is, the towns have had 30, 40 years, haven't done any affordable housing since the late 60s. The towns have not encouraged it, shutting it off regularly. They said the housing like we all moved into 50 years ago. But they've been shutting it down by their zoning regulations in spite of their plan of conservation and development. And the eloquent words they put in there about affordable housing, they just haven't delivered. In all due respect, Mike, they just haven't delivered. So what do you do when they don't deliver? Yeah, please put it in some place in your town where you want it. Where do you think they're going to put it? They're going to put it where there's the rock and the wetlands and all the other stuff where you can't really build it. That's the reality of what happens when you leave it to that kind of thing. From a private developer's point of view, and I represent both private and nonprofits here tonight. From a private developer's point of view, that's not our first choice. By any stretch of the imagination, it isn't our first choice. The incentive housing zone would be the first choice. First, it's more economically feasible from a developer's point of view, because only 20% of the project has to be affordable to 80% of median income. That's doable from a private developer's point of view with no state, federal, tax money or anything else involved in that project. 830G becomes more difficult, not only for the developer, because it's 30% of the project, and half of those at 60% of median income. That's a tough nut. You basically got to give those units away and you're going to lose money on them. We did the units in Niantic. The whole project as a total worked, but it wasn't one of the best financial projects we ever built. But it worked, and it worked for one simple reason. We bought that property at the asking price as it was zoned, which was at that point a light commercial site. Now, most of you probably know where it is. It's just to the left of the east of the Rocky Neck connector up on the hill. We paid the asking price as a commercial site. The developer was thrilled. We found out that we were going to put housing in, and he would have loved to have gotten a higher price. And so the land cost came in based upon the density at a price that made it feasible to do that. In Old Saybrook, where they've got the incentive housing zone, there have been 2 830G projects approved, friendly projects, meaning there was virtually no opposition. One is a marina, going to be very high end with 30% of that project as affordable. Another one is a small project on the Westbrook, near the Westbrook town line, a small condominium project. and the developer chose to use 830G instead of the incentive housing zone, and the town is happy with it. It's a nice little project, there's nothing to, you could drive by it all day long and never know it's an affordable housing project. So, you haven't told me the problem, Mike, in all due respects. You give me all kinds of stuff out there, but point to the project, it's so bad, that, as Tim said, that it should never have been built. And point to the people in there and say, I don't want them in my town. You can't do that. Maybe there's one out there out of those 12,000 units. I haven't seen it. I put that down. The other part is, the 60% of median income is a tough threshold for the buyer to meet. The definition of affordable is you spend no more than 30% of your adjusted income. You gotta make less than 60% of median income to qualify for that unit, and you can spend no more than 30% of your income for housing costs. That's mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities, and that kind of stuff. I've gone through the number, and it's very hard to live on what's left. And so I think you're gonna find the failure rate and that kind of thing is higher than it is at the 80% level. In market rate units, for nonprofits, there's money available to help subsidize the renter or the buyer that is not readily available to the free market system, meaning the private builder. So the nonprofits can do a much better job with it than the for-profits. Tim, do you have any idea how many of those 12,000 units were built by nonprofits as opposed to for-profit builders? Any feel for that at all?
Not really, but I'm going to guess about 10%.
We're for-profit?
We're non-profit.
We're nonprofits, okay. From one of the other issues about decide where you're going to put it, it's got to be marketable to somebody who wants to buy it. 70% of that project is market rate if you're going to be doing it as a for-profit builder. So that may not be a location where anybody would want to live. It may not even be a location where there's land available. If you're really serious about doing some affordable housing, it's got to be in a location where it has some desirability for the people that are going to live there, and the land is available. Without those two factors, all of the rules and planning in the world, in all due respects, doesn't work. You got a nice piece of land zoned for, say, took a big chunk of land and zoned it for an incentive housing zone. I doubt if anything's going to get built in there. There's no land available. I mean, nobody has put that land on the market. And they didn't realize that at the time they did it. They thought, goodness sakes, they beat a path to our door. Lessons have been learned, whether it be 830G or the incentive housing zone. Put it in the right place, and the right place includes marketability and availability.
Thank you, Bob. Unless the panel objects and needs to correct something that someone else said or takes issue with something someone else said on that particular question, I'm going to move to the second question. Is that all right? So the second question is, we're switching gears here a little, we're coming back to home Connecticut. Mike, what are the factors that may be preventing more widespread use of the Housing for Economic Growth or Home Connecticut program?
That one, again, I don't have as much experience with the Home Connecticut program, so I'm not a good one to answer that, Jim, so I'll just pass on that.
All right. Tim, would you like to tackle it?
Yeah, well, David alluded to the fact that Home Connecticut was passed in 2007, right into eventually the teeth of the recession in the housing market, so it was sort of on hold, and then the state's budget problems kicked in, so the incentive money, which was the key to the program, disappeared, and it was just bad timing. But on the substance side, the issue with Home Connecticut, and we've seen this over and over again, is resistance, I guess is the right word, to the higher densities that Home Connecticut requires. Now remember, the theory of Home Connecticut is to put in place higher density zones that are as of right development. And the purpose of that is so that there is zoned land around the state that a developer can come in, get quick approvals, and get the housing built. One of the things we heard from the people from Massachusetts, who, again, we sort of copied one of their systems, is there were so many instances where a developer bought a piece of land in one market, and by the time they got through the approval process, the market had changed, and the development approvals that they get weren't really worth anything because housing preferences have changed, the plans have changed, construction costs have changed. So it's to minimize this difference between purchase of land, getting approvals, and building and occupancy. And that's what Home Connecticut tries to do. But we found a lot of municipalities resistant to the higher densities. And, you know, my mantra, and I might even gotten this from Bob years ago, is that I can show you 2 units per acre that looks overly dense, and I can show you 50 acres per unit that looks just fine. It's all in the design. And we just can't get hung up on the density numbers per se. We have to look at the design. There's a woman named Julie Campoli. What's her book, Density by Design?
Visualizing density.
Visualizing Density, who has a great illustration of how we should look at the design and not get caught up in the numbers. But I find too many towns and their staffs are caught up in the numbers without looking at what the design possibilities are.
Thank you. Bob, you built the first IHZ project in the state. Why aren't more people doing that? Why aren't they using Home
Well, I
Connecticut?
didn't go, I was part of the whole,
Part of it.
part of the whole, I was
Excuse me.
a director,
It was a
part of the whole
co-conspirator.
partnership, and there's brochures out there for this, and I would invite you to go buy it. This is 10 to the acre. When you drive by it, you look at the pictures, there's no fancy photography here or anything that tries to accomplish something that isn't really there. And I don't think that this would be out of place in 90% of the towns around here. Any event, why isn't it used more frequently? A couple of things. The one I want to get, which nobody really wants to talk about, is even though the densities are great, 20 to the acre for multifamily, 10 to the acre for townhouses, 6 to the acre for single family, most of the areas in these towns, at least the shoreline towns where Hope is active, where I've been active, don't have water. They have water, but they don't have soil. And unless you've got Class A soils, you're not going to be able to do a ferry crossing at 10 to the acre. And while we want, with an 830G, we can get whatever density we want. Mike is right, anything that we think would work to meet the health codes. Can't meet the health codes in many cases at 10 to the acre. This is probably the most popular thing that will be done under the incentive housing zone is the townhouse 10 to the acre thing. And you can't do it with anything other than Class A soil. That has got to change. I think it's a change that should be 10 to the acre or whatever the health code will allow. It's 9 to the acre, 8 to the acre, 7 to the acre, then you have to, because at 10, in many cases, you can't meet the health code. So it's a waste of time. But this allows the towns to decide where they want to put it. And it gives the builders the certainty that we're talking about. If we want anything from the planners and the commissions, let me back up to just a moment on the building permit. If I want to build anything, all I have to do is carry my plans, proper engineering stamps over into the planning department, and the staff, the administrative staff, approves or disapproves it. It doesn't even disapprove. It says, Ed, you've got to change this because it doesn't meet the code. Sometimes it meets the code, but this is what we like to do in our town. And it's all done administratively. And when you meet it, you got your building permit, and you're ready to go out and pound nails. But when I want to get site plan approval, I have to go through at least 3 public hearings. A wetlands meeting, a planning, and a zoning. Now, sometimes that planning and zoning, they cut it down to 2. I've yet to figure out what input the public has to something that I either meet or don't meet. There are regulations and they're pretty specific. I meet them, I should be able to get my approval. If I don't meet them, I deserve to get turned down. If I want a waiver, now the public should be involved, no question about that. But if I meet it, but no, the public gets up and gets to say a lot of things from a non-expert point of view, with some may be an engineer or have some knowledge, but for the most part they don't. And that is an influence on what the commissioners say. This incentive housing zone gives the builders that kind of certainty that Tim just talked about. That's a huge element. If you really want it, if you really want to do affordable housing, and you create an incentive housing zone, the development community will come in. Because we have that edge of certainty that we would not otherwise have. And the chances of even having an appeal of either case is 0. Even with the 830G and the appeal, we don't want appeals. That's how long it's tied up. My attorneys Gotta fight it, the time is uncertain, and I still don't know what the outcome's gonna be. This kind of thing, we know what the outcome's gonna be. It's a great tool, needs some tweaking. One other thing I would suggest, even though there's no money available for the incentive part, I don't think the incentive part is set up properly anyway. My opinion, it should be a smaller amount. It's 2,000 when they approve a zone and 2,000 when you get a permit, 5,000 for single-family house?
Yes.
And I think there should be heavily loaded on the back end. Should be a great incentive to get a building permit, not just to create a zone.
I'm
Because
gonna
you
turn
can
to
create
Jamie.
zones and never have anything built, and I don't think a town deserves money for that.
Jamie, I just heard Bob say, one of the, I guess, attributes of the Home Connecticut program is the certainty that it provides builders. You earlier had said that 830G doesn't provide certainty to municipal planning and zoning commissions. How would you look at Home Connecticut, the incentive housing zone program? Why do you think it's not being used more?
Probably twofold, and Tim mentioned earlier, you got a date of 2007, we have recession in 2008, 2009. I don't believe what some of the federal economists say, we're still in it, and probably won't come out of it for another 2 or 3 years, if not a little longer. But a lot of it is also reaching out to the planning community. David's trying hard doing that. I think also it's, Bob touched on simplifying the funding process. And I'm gonna hone in on a couple things that Bob said, because I think there are two aspects. 830G provides uncertainty. Uncertainty on behalf of the community and uncertainty on behalf of the applicant, because he really doesn't know. I'm gonna put together the best application I think I can, but when he submits it, he has an idea of how the commission and the community is gonna react, but he still doesn't know the outcome. But with the incentive housing zone, I think municipalities or commissions would be more likely to use it if it offered them some protection from 830J. Right now, if I do an incentive housing zone, I am ultimately still susceptible to 830J. I'm the planner in Lisbon. We have very limited sewer and water. The town's plan of conservation and development has predicated that all the land that has sewer and water is commercial or industrial in nature. I would have to convince them at densities of 10 an acre to put that incentive housing zone where they wanted and have a Walmart, or they want Ruby Tuesdays and have a Ruby Tuesdays. So I have to switch that mindset at the local level. And they're only going to do that with some certainty and not uncertainty. Certainty is they know what density it may be, and they're going to know what it may look like at that density. Because Julie Campone's great, Randall Aaron's great. We've all seen the pretty pictures of the wonderful developments, but there's a lot of them that don't end up looking like the pretty picture. If in the incentive housing zone, we can look at good planning and where the perception of these at the local level will allow them to be built. I hope I said that correctly. There's the perception of what it looks like, there's a perception of density. You have to get that through a local layperson who typically serves on your commission of where these things may be appropriate in the community. They're only potentially going to do that if they're reassured that it isn't going to happen just outside the zone. Because if someone's at 10 units per acre at 80% and the land values are at $80,000 an acre and the land next door is a little rocky or a little more wet and only $10,000 an acre, but I can 830G that and even get 20 units an acre, the town's going to be weary of doing the incentive housing zone when they still can get 830G there. They can do all the best planning in the world and put it in the best locations. In some communities, I'll disagree a little bit with them. Some communities do good planning and pick where things belong. Unfortunately, we can't control the private sector. Where we pick things to go sometimes, the private sector doesn't own, the people who want to build them, that's not the piece of land they own. They own the one down the street, which isn't in the incentive housing zone. If they want to do affordable housing, they're still going to 830G potentially. So I agree with the fact that an incentive housing zone could potentially work. I think an incentive housing zone gives an exceptional amount of potential certainty to a municipality and an applicant that here's where we picked a spot it should go or an area. Here's the density we've chosen. And I'm going to use this that Bob has here. Here's what it's going to look like. And the design criteria is contained within the zone. So as long as you build to this design criteria at this particular density, approval should be simple. I said that in my opening remarks. Commissions are used to ruling on applications. It meets the regs, you approve it. If it doesn't meet the regs, you shouldn't approve it. The developer has some certainty that if there's 10 criteria he should meet, and the commission still denies it, attorneys, as well versed as Mike and Tim, know with some certainty that if there were 10 criteria and their clients met them, that's an easy decision to overturn in court potentially, versus arguing arbitrary health safety protocol. I'd like to bring more certainty to incentive housing
let's
and
come back to
buy
how
that to 830G.
Yeah, let's come back to how we'd improve it. I want to ask David why he thinks, besides the fact that when it was created and when it became a statute, the economy was in a spiral down. But what else is preventing more widespread use of it? Why don't towns want affordable housing?
Okay, very quickly first, I just want to talk about the fact that the funding and the incentives can be taken care of. That's not a problem. We're fixing that, and the legislature and the governor are intent on increasing the incentives again. So that's number one. Number two, the density can be taken care of, and what Jamie was talking about is exactly right. We created these densities based on recommendations from people in Massachusetts. Home builders signed off on it. They need the density that we put in to recover and make a profit. They need to spread their land cost over more units of housing. So the densities are there. We are working with DEEP and Department of Public Health and DOH on the sewer issue. So that in Massachusetts, just very quickly, in Massachusetts, you don't have to go to the Department of Environmental Protection, until you get to 10,000 gallons of wastewater a day, and they figure that on 110 gallons per bedroom. So that gives you a 91 or 92 bedroom project. That's 60 units of 2 bedrooms, 32s and 31s. That's a sweet spot. That's to scale in a lot of towns, and the builder can make a profit on that. The problem in Connecticut is it's 5,000 gallons based on 150 gallons a day per bedroom. That's a 30 or 31 bedroom project. That's a very small project. No builder, even one as skillful as Bob, can make any money on that deal. So we are working with them so that Bob, Norton, other guys don't have to go to DEP where there's no certainty after they spend a lot of money on studies that they're going to get an approval. They can go to the local health authority, the Department of Public Health, and get the permit. So we can deal with the certainty of it. We can deal with how it's going to look, because the incentive housing zone statute has a separate design regulation. The problem we've dealt with there is, and this is what I think is really the problem, to answer your question, we have zoning and planning commissions around the state that are used to being reactive. They're waiting for Bob or Norton or another builder to walk in and say, I bought this land here, here are my blueprints, here's what I want to build, what do you think? What the incentive housing zone statute asks town to do, but they're not ready to do it, and this is the problem, is be proactive. In all of our towns, we proactively think about education and sanitation and recreation and all the other key elements, public safety, except housing. Now, Mike argued, well, we kind of do that with housing because we zone comprehensively. Horse feathers. we zone less than comprehensively because we don't zone to make sure that we have a wide array of housing units for all the different types of people we need in town, and therefore we exclude them. And so that's why you have an 830G, to force towns that have been blind to it to do something. Incentive housing zone says to them, no, you don't have to get it shoved down your throat by a developer. You can plan for it. You got a zone for it. And frankly, you can meet the objections of commissioners I know who don't want that industrial or commercial property zoned for housing because they're certain some manufacturer is going to come in and build a factory there. Or some big box store is going to come in and do commercial work there. And it's a pipe dream in a lot of those places. But the incentive housing zone is created so that it's an overlay zone. You can say to those commissioners, we're going to overlay this residential development, and we're going to keep the industrial there. So if a guy comes in and he wants to manufacture something there, great if he comes first. But if Norton comes in first and says, I want to build housing there, now they got a choice. So the problem with the incentive housing zone program is towns don't yet know how to let go of the side of the pool. They are stuck with the old way of doing things. Tim will bear this out. Rather than create an incentive housing zone regulation with everything you want in that zone and an attendant design regulation to talk about exactly how you want it to look like, they still want to do a special permit. You can do everything on the front end. You can order up from the kitchen exactly how you want the steak and what sides you want and everything you want with the incentive housing zone statute. But they're not used to doing that. And they're not used to proactively taking care of the housing needs of the town by thinking about what housing do we need, what do we have, where do we want to put it. And that's what has to happen. We have to teach towns how to do it.
Thank you, David. We've discussed problems and drawbacks with 830G and the Home Connecticut program. I'm going to switch gears now, and I'm going to start with Jamie, and I'm going to ask you all to be succinct in the interest of time so we can get through the next couple of questions and leave time for audience participation. So please, if you would, starting with Jamie, what are the 2 or 3 modifications that you would ask the General Assembly to make to 830G that would make the statute more favorably considered by both home builders and the municipal planning and zoning commissions that are subject to appeal under the statute?
I think I touched upon this a little bit earlier, that if you entered into an incentive housing zone, you get some protection from 830G, whether it's indefinitely or not. Prime example, one of our budding municipalities to this region has roughly 2,800 housing units in the entire town. 31 of those are defined affordable. If they were to do an incentive housing zone, they would still be susceptible to 830G, and they would not be susceptible to 830G until they built another 1,400 units, and 30% of those were affordable. So they do an affordable and incentive housing zone, and they even allow for 1,000 units to be built. And of that incentive housing zone, the percentage of those are affordable. They do all this great planning. They built this impeccable system so Bob can come in and get his permits in a very simple, expeditious fashion. But then someone can go outside of that zone in a residential area, which Mike would say a town has decided it shouldn't go there based on their planning, their comprehensive plan, and do 830G. So a town who, takes this route, does what David's saying, is still susceptible to 830G. So I think there should be some relief from 830G if you do the incentive housing.
You would recommend the law be changed that a municipality that does an incentive housing zone, you would agree it'd have to be some minimum size, to allow a minimum number of units. It would have to be substantial.
Whether it's a percentage of existing housing stock, or a percentage with a certain density.
And they would be completely exempt from 830G.
They would. I don't see why they shouldn't be potential. It's doing what Bob and others at the table have asked us to do, to put some certainty forward so that a developer can come in with some certainty and build a development that at least one builder saying if it's right, we'll build it and it will work. And we have some certainty there.
Bob, would you agree with that point of view? Because I was going to call on you next as to
Not,
what you would recommend.
not exactly. I think that there may be a germ of an idea there, but I think the reality, because let's get back to reality and what really happens in the real world. If the town is sincere and does a really good job of creating incentive housing zone or zones in the areas of town that it deems is appropriate, and areas where there is the appropriate utilities to be able to do it, and where the probability of land being available, and towns know what's happening. The Farmer Jones is now 90 years old, and his land is probably not available, or it's not, based on what else, other factors. I mean, any town that's worth its salt knows those factors, and is sincere in what it does. We're not idiots in the development industry. That's where we're going to go. We're not going to be looking for land where we got to fight a bunch of battles and public hearing crowds and that whole thing. That isn't what we're all about. Create the incentive. That's what it's about. Yeah, do you think the incentive is the money that's going to go to the town? The incentive is the incentive for the development community to follow where you want us to be. And right now, your plans say, I don't want you in my town. And if you are going to come here, we're just going to give you a hard time. That's the wrong kind of incentive. Create the incentive. 830G will almost go away by itself. I don't think you have to change 830G. Try it out. See what happens. If I'm wrong, then you got a good argument.
David, I'm going to call on you next. What modifications would you propose to 830G?
I think I referred to it earlier, and you wondered why I called 830G a tool for the town. So I think it gets to Jamie's example. Lisbon doesn't have to create that many units. Lisbon can create on the order of about, depending on the point structure for how many points you get per unit, maybe about 50 units of housing to get a 4-year moratorium. They don't have to create all those, and then they're exempt from 830G. And to get to Jim's question, and no, I don't think they should get a moratorium for 830G forever. They should get it for 4 years after doing a limited amount, a bite-sized piece, if you will, and then they get the 4 years to do some planning to do the next bite-sized piece. And that's the point of the moratorium. This was all looked at by the Blue Ribbon Commission in 2000, and that's why they came up with the moratorium. So what I would do is I would add to 830G help for the towns. And the problem with towns is, I used to be a newspaper reporter and editor, and it was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and in the end it relied on 11-year-old kids on bicycles to deliver the product. It's kind of a weak link, right? Well, here we have a state its economy is dependent on having enough housing options for all the people we need in the state. And because we don't have them, we've had a huge exodus of 25 to 34-year-olds. Our kids can't come home to live here. Our older people can't downsize. And we have the largest achievement gap in the country because parents don't get many choices about where to live and which schools work for their kids. So what we need to do is make sure that towns get help, maybe first achieving the moratorium, and then learning how to do what cities know how to do, which is to redevelop properties. I've heard towns say a gazillion times, we're built out. There's no place for us to build any more housing. And I say to them all the time, if there was such a thing as built out, you'd never see a crane in Manhattan. There's no such thing as built out. You redevelop properties, you repurpose them. And some towns know how to do that. Clinton, Willie Fritz is the first selectman, as Bob was saying, he knows every property in his downtown. He knows who's about to die, who's about to retire, who's about to sell their business, which properties are in play. And he knows which one of them would make for good housing, multifamily, that can accommodate the density. Towns need to learn how to do that. I understand, they don't know how. The planning department in a town, the planning department is one person. So we have to help the towns, and that's how I would change 830G. The problem is not the developers. Guys like Bob and Norton and Greg Ugaldi and a bunch of other guys I know make less money when they put an affordable set-aside there. They're willing to make less money. They're not money hungry. They want to make a profit because they got to pay their people. They will make less. and they will build affordable housing because they understand that everybody needs a place to live. So I would help the towns use 830G as a tool, and that's what I meant by that.
Tim, this might be a strange question to ask you because of the position you have taken in representing clients, but can you think of any recommendations that you would make to improve 830G?
Yeah, I'll actually agree with something Mike said earlier. We could go to a mandatory fair share system in Connecticut, the way they've had for decades in New Jersey. And require every town, and not just they get to pick, the rocky, wet, crummy land, but every town in Connecticut must provide, I'm just making this out of thin air, but every town must provide 3 sites that will accommodate at least 50 units in which there would be a set-aside affordable housing development. You, the town, get to pick the land, but here's the criteria for soils and slopes and everything you have to meet, so you don't pick land that's not developable. That would make 830G a lot easier. But if that were proposed in the legislature, it would be Armageddon, because the towns would say, Hartford imposing another mandate on the municipalities. But the point is, at the legislature every year, you either got to go one way or the other, and there has been so much resistance to using the so-called New Jersey fair share that 830G and Home Connecticut have been the next best alternatives.
How could 830G be improved for the types of clients you represent, the folks that are interested in building affordable housing?
As I said, the one-stop shopping on the permitting would combine zoning, zoning, sewer, and wetlands into one permit.
Could you see a compromise situation where the tinkering would be done to the statute that would make it a little bit more palatable to old town planners like Jamie and I? I mean, throwing density out the window, throwing setbacks, all the, stuff we learned, Euclidean zoning, it's troublesome, it's fearful.
Well, I'm sorry, you're not going to convince me that we ram this down people's throats and it's housing that nobody wants to. There's a very important self-regulating aspect to the housing industry, is that people like Bafusari and Nort are not going to build housing that's going to be empty at the end of the day. There's actually somebody who would like to move in there. Now, the people in the town, the regulators, don't want that number of people or those type of people. Let's put that on the table. But it's not like housing is being built in places where people don't want to live or it's ugly. There are always people who are willing to move in there. So, I just think we have to get away from this idea that housing is being shoved down people's throats. It may not be the type of housing in the location that the municipality, in its wisdom, would like, but to say that it's bad housing is quite a different story.
Thank you. Mike?
And Tim and I are on the same wavelength on that. I can't speak to the question of whether or not the legislature would adopt it or whether it would be subject to the type of resistance that Tim mentioned. I suspect he's probably right. But on the other hand, 830G effectively does just that. 8-30G effectively takes a state standard and applies it to municipalities. And my belief is, since the state is really doing that, maybe what we need is to educate the towns to the fact that that's what 830G does. It takes a state standard and makes towns comply with the state standard. And understanding that, then saying to the towns, you have the choice of using these standards to build the affordable housing in the areas that you think are best, but you must do it. You must do it. I don't think we have to be afraid or should be afraid of telling towns this is a state policy, like inland wetlands, it's a state policy, you must do this. You must choose those areas where this is going to happen. If you fail to do it, then you're subject to 830G, wherever people want to go. If we can do that, and Tim may have raised a good point about whether it's possible to get it through the legislature. If we could do that, I think that would be a better system and more consistent with what towns have come to hear is expected of them. Now, David said something before about it's horse feathers that towns are comprehensively planning. And I didn't say that they were. I didn't say towns were providing enough opportunities for affordable housing. That's not what I meant by that. What I meant by that was simply, from the standpoint of the law, comprehensive planning is you don't put the square peg in the round hole. And that's always been called spot zoning. And yet, affordable housing, in that sense of the word, is spot zoning. So I'm saying the towns have to put their money where their mouth is. They have to designate those areas, and as Tim said, I would have no problem with telling towns, you've got to demonstrate that the areas that you've chosen are susceptible to this, that they're not full of rocks, as Bob suggested, that either sewer and water are available, or the land has the type of soil capacity that will accommodate these things. They have to do that. I think that's fair. I think that is an approach that would solve the problem or help to solve the problem in a way that's much more consistent with the way state law works right now. So I agree with Tim to that extent.
That's great. Like the last question, but focusing on incentive housing zones, how would you improve the incentives? Now, Bob, I think you said earlier, you don't need to improve the incentives, or you might backload it.
No, I think the dollar incentives would be better with a small amount up front, and they create the zone. And then you can do 100 units, 200 units in the zone. That is, remember now, the zone is an overlay zone. And it's not expected that, even though theoretically you could build, let's say, 200 units in that zone, the reality is that's not ever going to happen. The underlying zone is going to be used from time to time to use up some of that area. Some of it may never get developed. So, but there is that opportunity, and not just spot. Now, I've seen towns, my hometown, Portland, that hired the very influential planner, the people who invented this stuff up in Massachusetts, and they came in and they were picking very specific sites, not an area, to have Portland put an incentive housing zone on. And I'm saying, where in the world did they come up with that idea? The idea is to create an area so that you create an incentive for the land seller and the builder to get together, not just one site, but a choice of sites that has some competition to it. Farmer Jones or landowner Jones and landowner Smith want to sell their property. Now the price is going to be fair because there's some competition, but if the zone is on one site, you just made somebody rich. That's all you've accomplished, and probably it isn't going to get built because now the price is going to skyrocket. And the incentive housing should be spread around. Towns are not thinking in those terms. And I didn't see OPM, and I am not familiar with what the Department of Housing is doing now that they're the administrator. But OPM, when they were doing it, part of that process was to be involved in the public outreach. Not the OPM involved, but it forced the town to have a public outreach program, or they were not going to get their incentive housing zone approved at the state level. And OPM was doing a real good job of that. I mean, they were tough. It wasn't just create a zone and plunk it down and give you some money. You've got to show that the town's people have bought into that, and you need a plan to do that. Some towns have done a super job. Avon with its charrette, I mean, very elaborate. Simsbury did a very elaborate charrette. Saybrook did a much smaller one. But the townspeople got involved in deciding where it was going to go and what type it was going to be. Single family, 10 to the acre, 20 to the acre, mixed use with some apartments above the shop, above the stores. But the townspeople were sitting around the table after an educational process that let them understand what it was about, and said, this is where I think it should go, this is where I think it should go. Photographs. The town planner went out and took pictures in town of the kinds of densities that already exist in town that we're talking about, that the townspeople had no clue that already exist in their town. You know, you could go to your town and you could pick up a 10 to the acre or something. Then people, I didn't know that was 10 to the acre, or whatever the density was. And particularly the shoreline towns, there are lots of cottages. The density gets pretty high on some of those places, and they work.
So you're telling me the key is education, and I think you mentioned that.
I can't.
David mentioned that.
I can't minimize that public outreach education. The best tool to do that is the guy sitting at the end of it. He does a wonderful job. David and his crew and his staff, Katie and the other people there, they got all the tools to do that. Their website is rich in information, And if you're worried about who's going to live, they've got a great video. Hope has a great video on its website of people who really live in. So you put that to bed.
Jamie, what would it take, what do you need to go back to the Lisbon P&Z and say, hey, we need to start getting into IHGs? This is a great program, it's a great incentive. What changes could we make to the statute to make more towns interested in that?
I think, again, Tim and Mike touched upon and followed through with some of the thoughts I had earlier on is, again, some certainty that if they create an incentive housing zone, that's where housing of that density will go. So David said, I don't think if someone does an incentive housing zone, they should be exempt from 830G. I think some of the comments that Mike and Tim said, not reading into them, said that if you did an incentive housing zone appropriately, at an appropriate density, which allowed a particular number of housing developments to be built, perhaps all on sewer and water and good land, not rezoning the floodplain incentive housing zone, or I have a site in Lisbon that it was $16 million worth of site work to develop 300,000 square feet of retail. Retail can do that. Bob can't do that. I don't think it would be fair for Lisbon to rezone a piece of rock in incentive housing zone. But to really get them to buy in, they have to know that whether if they go through a charrette process, or they bring in Don Poland, they bring in an architect, and they do this process, that they're going to go through this hard and fast planning process that meets some certain given criteria, that brings certainty to the process for the municipality and the developer and the attorneys representing both sides. That someone, because they paid too much for a piece of land that they thought they could get 10 house lots for, but the town's only telling them 5 because they have new density regulations, so they decide, because they went to a home builder's workshop, to do an 830G. The town needs some certainty. And I think we're all slightly talking about the same thing, just a few words apart, and just mix in terms of density. Certainty of what it's going to look like, certainty of what the density is going to be. Bob's right. A lot of people don't understand density. They don't understand, most of us who grew up in northeastern Connecticut or eastern Connecticut, and stuff, every town has a town green, or some resemblance of a town green. Every town has a community or a borough or a section that has a mill village. And those village towns with the workers' housing and the managers' housing were built on 5,000 and 10,000 square foot lots. The difference is most of those communities were designed by well-trained planners, architects, and engineers. And the infrastructure existed for those densities. So I think what we're all saying is, let's make the provisions to allow a municipality to do it, but then steer housing there. Because if you don't, I still may get an 830G in the northwest corner of the town, 4 miles from the nearest bus, and no one will ever be able to walk from point A to point B because it's just isolated. And David, you mentioned there's always that one individual out there who's going to use the system to do 3 triplexes on 2 acres. Because 830G allows them to do it. And let's not allow that. I think Bob said it, a little bit. If I know the process, I'm willing to follow it. As long as it's not just the wizard behind the curtain, that it's real, and Tim would push it. No one wants to rezone the floodplain to an incentive housing. Let's make it real. Make us make it real.
Mike, did you propose any incentives over and above what's now in the incentive housing zone program?
No, I think the other comments have addressed it pretty much. I really do think that the incentive housing program is good in the sense that it causes towns to it may give towns an extra cause to want to develop affordable housing, but I think ultimately if we really want to get the amount of affordable housing that we need in the state of Connecticut, I think the state has ultimately got to bite the bullet and really force towns, really say to towns, you just have to do this. You have to create these zones. If that's too difficult to get through the legislature, I don't know. But I think that's ultimately what has to be done.
Tim? Any additional incentives to the Home Connecticut program?
Well, you know, we talked about linking Home Connecticut and 830G with moratorium points. If you adopt an IHC and if you get units built under it, you get points toward an 830G exemption. I'd be okay with that.
Okay. So, great. David, how do you feel about that?
I think that you can use an incentive housing zone, but you can use pretty much any zoning tool and housing creation tool to get points for a moratorium, as long as those units are deed restricted or otherwise guaranteed to remain affordable. The way I would make the incentive housing zone statute better is we just met with the Undersecretary for Housing and Community Development in Massachusetts and some of his people. Every town in Massachusetts knows that if they create an incentive housing zone, they get preference for infrastructure money. That's a good incentive for towns.
A lot of money.
A lot of them. They get a lot of money. I would also say, and Bob's right, but we're working towards this. Yeah, we should give a minimal amount when they create the zone. We should give a lot more money when they issue building permits or certificates of occupancy in the zone. I think that can work. You know, this is all based on, you know, some first selectman has said to me, well, you know, it's really not that much money because, so we'll get, you know, $500,000, $600,000 one time, and that doesn't really do it for us, and we'll get a little infrastructure money. And, you know, I tell them about, you know, why McDonald's has Happy Meals. You know, a mom can bring her kid in and get them a separate cheeseburger and a separate fries and a separate soda, and it's not as good as putting it in a colorful bag and giving them a 2-cent piece of plastic to take home. For the first selectman needs to show the town that because we created this housing, we got infrastructure money and some other money so we could buy a fire truck, or we could fix the sidewalks and the planters and the street lamps and the storefronts in this area, and the town recognizes we got something for this. So I think there's value to that. You have to give the town something. But Bob's exactly right. The most important incentive in the incentive housing zone is the incentive for the developer. And that's what the town gets too, because if the developer knows all he needs is site plan approval, he can be in and out in a year, he can hit the market, while the market's right for the product that he's building, and not have to fight for 3 or 4 years in court. The builder wins, the town wins, because the town he's going to choose that every day, you know, as opposed to fighting the town in court for 3 or 4 years. You choose that all the time. And most importantly, the residents win, because you get housing in the town for the people you need. One last story. 3 years ago in February, we had a huge snowstorm in the northern 2/3 of the state. Fairfield, Connecticut had to cancel school that day. Why?
Teachers couldn't get to work.
Teachers all lived 5 or 6 towns away. All they had was rain in Fairfield. I mean, if you want your teachers and your police and your firefighters and others to live in the town, if you want your kids to come home and be able to live in the town they grew up in, if you want your parents to be able to downsize in the town, you've got to create different options. We have 122 towns in the state where more than 70% of the housing is single family. A lot of them are 80 and 90%. These towns are heavily skewed to one product. In the town's interest, they ought to know it, and we should help them.
Thank you very much. We're now in the home stretch. This is the lightning round. You have 1 minute each, and I will cut you off at 61 seconds if you wish to provide a concluding statement. And I'm going to start with the original order. David?
I think I just...
I think you did. Mike?
One thing I would say, I think it's kind of ironic when we're talking about moratorium. It's the concept behind the existing 830G that bothers me. And when we talk about a moratorium, we give a moratorium for people who have gone through the 830G process. That, to me, is ironic, because that's almost suggesting that the 830G process created something bad. Because if it created something good, why do we need a moratorium from it for 4 years? And I think we need to turn that around. And I don't think we're going to turn it around with 830G itself. And that's why I think we have to go to a more formal process where the state says, okay, folks, this is our policy, this is state policy, this is something you must do, you must develop affordable housing, and not make it something that is bad and needs to be subject to a moratorium after it happens, but something that's good and can continue to happen because the town has now complied with an order to actually designate specific areas where it can and will happen.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, we have a moratorium because in 1999, when the state as a whole decided to look at 830G, one of the things municipalities said was, if we're going to approve this housing, we need some time to absorb the impact. So that was provided to it. It came from the municipalities. But I will finish at a 30,000-foot level and just tell you one quick story. About 15 years ago in the town of Simsbury, up in the northwest hills of the state, very affluent town, I was the attorney representing a developer who wanted to do several hundred units, mix of townhomes and single family. The townhomes would have been the affordable. And I remember very distinctly after the second night of, I talked before about angry public hearings. The town was absolutely up in arms. And it was pretty heated for hours and hours on end. And anyway, as I'm leaving the hearing room after the second night, an older man, probably in his maybe early 80s, in a black raincoat and a black fedora, and a very distinguished looking man, he takes me aside. He says, "Mr. Hollister, may I ask you a question?" I said, "Certainly." He said, "Why are you proposing people from out of town to come to Simsbury?" He said, and I'll never forget this, "Simsbury is for substantial people." Now, you know what? You could dismiss that story and say, okay, that's one man. But you know what? If I tried to wrap 30-plus years of developing affordable housing into a feeling, and it's not racial, and it's not ethnic, and it's not economic. It's the feeling that I worked to live in the town that I live in, and I don't want anybody else to get a free ride. And I just think, as my opinion, what gets lost in that is that the towns don't use their land use system to open it up to other people, and housing opportunities to other people. I mean, at a 30,000-foot level, if you want to know where we need to change the culture, that's where we need to change it.
Bob, 1 minute if you could.
I couldn't agree more with what Tim said and what David said, and I do agree with, I think, some of the things you said. I don't agree with all, because things that are not going to happen politically are not going to happen politically. And if that had any chance of happening, I would not disagree with it, but we could get back to reality. This is very personal for me. I've been involved in the business 60 years. It's my 60th year. And about 58 years ago, I bought my first house, like many people in this room. I told you about that earlier. And my grandkids can't do that. I did not go to college. My grandkids are coming out of college and can't do what I did in 1959, and that is wrong. It isn't just the planners or the zoning commission members, it's you. Don't do anything about it. You don't talk about it at the Little League game. You don't talk about it at the grocery store. And somebody mentions it to you, you get defensive. Be offensive. You know the facts. Look at the people that I challenge you to go to our project, Sea Spray, in Niantic, and pick out the affordable units. And if you think it's the one with the junky car in front of it, you're wrong. You're dead wrong. It is not at all what we think. We're talking about us. We're not talking about them, like the gentleman he was at in his story. It's really us. It's my kids. It's my grandkids. Maybe I have a great-grandkid going to come in November, so that's my first one. But those are the people, the firemen who can't live in the town. In Saybrook we have a volunteer fire department. You don't live in Old Saybrook, you can't be in the fire department. Where the hell, you want to coach? They can't get coaches to run up and down the field with the kids. The only coaches are 50, 60, my age. Now, I'm going to run up and down the field with the kids. I don't know how many people here are going to run up and down the field with the kids. The town is going to die if we don't provide the ability. You don't have to build the houses. Just allow it. That's all we're asking for. One thing that gets me ticked off when the town says, we did our share. And the town that maybe has 8% or 7%. And my question is, what did you do? to earn your share. What did you, the town, did you spend any of your money? Did you spend any of your time or your resources? And the answer is I haven't got a clue what they did. It was done in spite of them, not because of them.
Jamie, how would you conclude?
Just again,
You only
looking,
have 1 minute.
Mike, you gonna hold me to that, or not sign my paycheck? Again, with regard to 830G, I think there's been some great discussion on it this evening. I still think we all may not look like it, but we share the common goal of looking at affordable housing and figuring out how we can make it more acceptable to communities and more accessible to people who need that type of workforce housing. I'm still a strong believer in the fact, even if I turned my town upside down and got rid of every R80 and R40 zone and went to 10,000 square feet and 20,000 square foot lots and said developers can now come in at this 4-acre unit density, I'm still susceptible to 830G until I meet this arbitrary 10% that has to be CHFA or deed restricted. So even if I turn my whole town into a city, this rural town that I work for into a city, I still got 830G. And the market rates are going to reflect that you can build at this increased density. So that 1 acre that used to be worth 50 may now be worth 75 because I can put 4 units on it. So I think there's got to be some give and take between 830G or something that's mandated by the state that a town has to revise its zoning to allow a certain density, to have a certain percentage of housing units available at some type of market rate. But I think some of the biggest things that I'm always reminded to and of when I go back to my education and planning school is that ultimately, as a municipal planner, we really don't control the thing. Because the private sector and the economy and the landowners determine what will be built and where it will be built, given market conditions and profit. So we can do the best plan and the best incentive, and someone can choose to do it 1 block away. So I think if a town chooses to go into this, again, they need some protection from someone deciding that it goes 2 streets over. When we planned for it, even at 10, 12, I mean, we have sewer and water, I can go 4 stories as long as fire protection allows it, and go to 20, 30 units an acre. But I don't know if a community is going to be willing to do that if I can go 2 blocks down the street and do something totally contrary to what we just spent 6 months or a year or 5 years planning for. That's the difficulty.
I've heard a lot of common ground and agreement here tonight. I don't know if we can put these gentlemen to work to amend the state statutes and hand them to Representative Ryan before he leaves tonight to bring to the General Assembly in the next session. Maybe I could ask you to stay later if I go get a couple more pieces. But what I'd like to do is turn it over to the audience, and if I could ask you to, you don't have to identify yourself, you can if you'd like, but would you direct your question to a specific panelist if it is for the panelist? I'll just call on you when I see you raise your hand, so. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for Tim Hollister. When you were working, the state was working on setting up the statute, why did you make the definition of affordable housing so restrictive? Jamie, I think you were the only one who mentioned that it seemed to you somewhat of a problem that housing that was modest in cost doesn't count. It has to be those specific restrictions in order to count toward 10%. Why?
Okay. Well, as often occurs with legislation, if you look under the hood, it's not quite as pretty as it may seem from the outside. But you're talking about the 10% list and the categories and what you need to get to exemption. And the first thing was we needed a system that was easy to count. That's actually one of the main reasons that CHFA mortgages are in there, because it's an easy number to find on a town-by-town basis. So that's the first level. Second level is that there was some effort to assess the impact on each municipality of either public housing, meaning assisted housing, subsidized housing. CHFA mortgages were again another sort of rough proxy for that. and then any housing that was deed restricted. So the idea was to make it countable and to identify what percentage of a town's housing stock is, it has higher burdens than, let's say, single-family detached housing or more affluent housing. So that was the two categories. The reason for the strict 830G restrictions, the price restrictions, you're always picking some arbitrary bright line in any type of legislation. But the idea is that we restrict the prices. There's always going to be some other housing in the town that fits that price category at this time. But the difference is that 830G is a long-term price restriction, and the formula is never going to go above a certain point based on the income and the criteria and the mortgage rates and so forth. But the other housing can go with the market. I was working on a matter the other day where the current median price in town is $180,000, but in 2005 the median in town was $269,000. So the 830G criteria make sure that the housing that is deemed affordable is never going to go up to 269. It may go up from 180 to 185, but it's not going to go to 269. So that so that's a little bit of the history of the of the 10% list. The other thing, and this is sort of a folklore around the capital, is there's 31 towns that are exempt. Now, why did we pick? It wasn't me, but why was 31 towns picked? Well, guess what? Guess where the votes come year after year to preserve 830G? That's your base, is the 30 towns that are 10% or more. And last answer is we copied Massachusetts, and they had a system that was in place for 20 years and seemed to be doing well.
Tim, can I just ask, why 40 years? Why are there?
It started out at 20, and it went to 25, and then 30, and then 40. The feeling, there was actually a proposal in 2000 to make it in perpetuity. 40 years is a rough approximate. 30 years is actually the best number, because that's the standard length of a mortgage you can get from a bank. But when in year 2000, the low-income housing advocates asked us to have deeper targeting for lower income households, and they wanted a longer period. Is 40 years actually based on something? It's 10 years longer than 30. That's the best answer I can.
David, you wanted to add?
I would just say, that's a very good question, but I think the simple answer, and Tim gave you a good answer, but the simple answer is that definition of affordable housing is that it's guaranteed to remain affordable for the 40-year period of the deed restriction, or sometimes less, sometimes more, because there was government financing or some kind of subsidy that required that these remain affordable. Market rate units will rise or fall, and as Tim said, sometimes they will stay affordable to people, or people can't afford to buy them, but the market will cause them to rise. So the best recent example was Blueback Square in West Hartford. They had one-bedroom apartments that began to rent for about $1,200. They don't rent for $1,200 anymore. And the problem in the state is that we don't have, as I said earlier, we have so much single-family housing and so little of the rest. We have a supply problem. Connecticut is 50th in the nation over the last decade in units built per capita, all units. And what we built is not what we need. We built a lot of big colonials and a lot of 55 and older luxury retirement communities, and not a lot of the rest. So just because we have so little supply, those affordable units get beat up, so they're not affordable anymore. And that's the reason. We want to make sure units remain affordable, guarantee that they stay that way. And that's why we have a deed restriction or some other restriction.
Are there any other questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
More of a comment. Tim Ryan from New London. A lot of commentators here have painted more of a black and white picture of if you zone it, they will come. And that's not true. I see it in New London all the time. We have a substantial IHC zone. I don't see people like Bob coming in every day to build stuff, to redevelop areas in New London. So I think there's greater socioeconomic barriers and obstacles that are at play. So just a comment, not necessarily a question, but I don't want anybody to walk away from here thinking that an IHC or this 830G is a solution. It's not. It's more complicated than that. And the sooner you realize that, the sooner you realize there's a lot of interdependencies, and you work to solve those, like the infrastructure improvements. How about making payments on time for the incentive housing? I think we may have just gotten our first payment, may have, and it's a partial. So it's not really working, all right? The process isn't working, and that may be part of the reason why people aren't adopting it so far, or eagerly attracted to it. So that's just my take from my viewpoint in New London, but we've got a healthy industry there, but we're just not getting a lot of development there. And we are one of those communities where people live outside of us. You know, we have Electric Boat, we had Pfizer. They left, but that was for a different reason altogether. We have L&M. We have a lot of tax-exempt entities that are huge employers. And that's one of our issues. So that's another extraneous issue that we have going on, is our tax-exempt status for almost 50% of our land. So we've got an issue there. And it's bigger than just an overlay zone or having a hammer like the 30G come down on us, which we don't.
What's allowed in New London zone?
The what?
What's allowed in the New London zone?
In the IHC?
Yeah.
As far as what?
What type of housing?
Oh, geez, is density requirements? Or
I mean, is it multifamily townhouses?
multifamily? I mean, it ranges from, I think it actually extends from our central business district, which has no density limit, to our R3 zone, so anything in between. So we've got more than enough density in there. We have one proposal that's on the table now that I can't really talk about too much, but that's about it. And, you know, he's on his own, he's doing the best he can, but it's predicated on getting people in there to see the property and understand the socioeconomic barriers at play. And, you know, our IHC, I don't know how, I'm sure some of you must be familiar with the IHC in New London, but it's right in the middle of the city. And I also think there's a huge connection between a municipality's social services and whether or not it's going to attract an IHC or be applicable to an IHC or an 830G building. The one that has a lot of social services, outside towns don't. What do you think happens to us?
You know, it's a good, New London and Torrington are the only cities that created incentive housing zones so far. And, you know, Bob Fazzari or Norton Wheeler are not going to go anywhere they can't make money. I mean, they don't want to make a lot of money, but they got to at least be able to pay their workers. And the market hasn't gotten to New London yet. Now, when you have more frequent Shoreline East service and when schools are better, and I mean, you know, there's a lot that goes into the value of housing.
There you go.
And the market rate units in an IHC have to pay for the affordable units, and it's only going to happen. I mean, conversely, that's the interesting thing about 830G. Most places that have an 830G are places where the market supports those market rate units, so that the developer can build it. And I would say, by the same token, that places that don't have a very hot market are not going to get many 830G proposals. They'll get some, but sometimes they're, an effort to kind of push the town to do what he wants. You know, when I've said to some first selectmen, call their bluff, because they ultimately can't build it. If they can't get enough money for the market rate units, they can't do the 830G.
Questions? I'm going to call on Chairman Wheeler, Mr. Bolick, Mr. Gardner, did you raise your hand? All right, if I could go in that order, please.
Jim, more of a comment from a builder-developer standpoint. Every project that we look at, or every piece of property we look at, we look at it and we have to work backwards from when we first see a property, we say, all right, what could be built here and what's the market here? And we have to kind of work backwards from that to determine what the land cost can be. And so the issue that we have is that if the only incentive housing zone areas already has homes on it and people are living in them, we can't go and buy homes for $400,000 a piece to tear them down to build affordable housing, in downtown Mystic or something. I mean, it just doesn't happen. So the issue is if we need affordable land in areas where we can have the density, that we can build neighborhoods where kids can ride their bikes and you can walk to buy a loaf of bread. That's what we need. But it has to be land that is priced
reasonably well, so that we can do that and be able to sell something to someone that they can afford to buy, and that we can afford to build it and be able to make enough of a profit on it to live, to be able to go acquire the next property and do the next one. There's no project that Bob has ever done or I've ever done that when we were done, we could just, go to the Caribbean for 5 years and sit on the beach until the money runs out. Basically, when you're done with this project, with whatever project it is, you have cash flow during that process, and when the job is over, there is no pot of gold, as everyone thinks that there is for the developers. We're just looking to create an income for our families so that our kids can go to college and get a good education, so hopefully they don't have to work as hard as Bob. That's the general picture from our standpoint.
Thank you, John.
Couple of comments. First one, isn't it ironic that with an 830G, the legal expenses involved by both the town and the developer wind up spending taxpayer money as well as making what's developed less affordable? Am I right?
There are situations like that. I will tell you, the trend over the last 5 years has been more approvals and more settlements of 830G and less litigation than we had in the first 10 or 15 years. That's a good development. On the other end of the scale is Stratford, where they fought a developer for 11 years, spent $1.5 million, and the development's just about ready to open its doors. So,
And they're less affordable than if they...
yeah.
The only other comment I have, and this applies to all development, the regular stuff that Bob and Nord do, as well as 832, or even the home Connecticut legislation. And the development process takes way too long. With all the approvals that you have, you can spend 3 years going through the approval process, and time is money. If the legislature could do something to speed that process up, time is money, the cost to the developer would be less, and we'd be producing more affordable housing. That's especially true in commercial, by the way.
Buddy?
I had a question for Mr. Sorrow. You had mentioned that in the affordable housing programs you've seen, that the failure rate is basically in the 60th percentile. Most of your failures, you're seeing the person that's probably financially strapped, and then you could bump that up to the 80% of the average median income. Is that correct?
Well, the incentive housing zone provides that a private developer has to provide 20% of the units at 80% of median income, right here.
But the 830G...
830G is 30%, half of them at 80, half of them at 60% of median income. So it's much more difficult for a private developer to pencil out a profitable project under 830G than it is under the incentive housing zone. So given the choice to build something in an incentive housing zone or go 2 blocks down the road due to under 830G, that doesn't a no-brainer. No one's going to do that unless you can buy the land for nothing, and that's not going to happen. Land is important, but there are a lot of other factors involved. But the town says, this is where we want it. We want affordable housing. We want it here. This is the design criteria, and I meet that, and I get a permit. I'm ready to go to work. Now, there's a lot of other things I got to deal with. So I've got to deal with traffic. I've got to deal with the environmental issues. Nothing has changed there. And I've got to deal with a myriad of other agencies, not necessarily municipal or state, but utility companies. Every utility company has got to be dealt with. We have a checklist that's over 50 agencies and departments long that we have to deal with before we ever put a shovel in the ground. So this isn't the thing that makes the whole ball game, but it's a nice field to be playing on.
But as far as the consumer goes, I think you had mentioned that the people that qualify for 60% of the average median income, you see the most amount of failures with that person that can't afford.
Yeah, we don't have the ability to track
Okay.
who wins and loses on those, but because those are the most difficult units to sell.
Right.
The 60% of median income, they're the most difficult ones for us to make any money on, obviously, but to sell because the buyer ability to live after they paid 30%, which is the standard of their income for housing, they didn't have a lot left to live on. That's typically would be the typical buyer for that unit would be a single mother. And if you tried to pencil out a budget for that family, using 30% of their adjusted gross income for housing at 60% of median income in East Lyme, it's tough to live on what's left. For the 80% are not an issue, particularly it's an issue if they have bought 2 cars and television sets and all that stuff, but typically the 80% is a doable thing. 60 is a little more difficult. There's some state programs that allow for down payments and other things. They did not apply in our case because we would have had to go through, as a developer, a special process called the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act. And it says that if the state of Connecticut has 1 cent in that project, you got to go through that act. We weren't using any state money. But if the buyer were to get any state money, that makes that project qualify to require that. And it was, no developer in his right mind would go through that process. Stop the project for 6 months and spend $60,000 and no assurance you're going to get approval. So we didn't do it. So the buyers could not get some of the money that was available through DECD and other agencies. There are some things that can be cleaned up to straighten that out. But the incentive housing zone is one that I think for the private developer works well. For the nonprofits, such as Ferry Crossing, which was built under IHC, but every unit is affordable, not just 20% of them.
Thank you. 3 of our panelists have come a long way, so I'm going to try to conclude on time in the interest of their long travel home. I'll take one more question, that being said. Are there any additional questions?
Now that you made everybody feel guilty.
Let me see if there's someone that hasn't asked one yet, if you don't mind. We are going to post this on our website. We're going to tweet it out. No, we're going to put it on Facebook, because we have new social media consultant here. And we hope that you'll share this with other folks in your towns, members of your planning and zoning commissions. I'm going to see to it that we send it to our legislators, because I thought it was a very interesting and informative discussion. Before I forget, I'd like to thank the panelists for their time. Dan, you have the last word.
Just a very quick comment, and that is, I think, David, you spoke about DEEP and their septic approvals and that onerous process. Well, I hope when you're talking to them and having the laws change, maybe you can do it for all developments, not just the affordable or the incentive, because they really are stupid how they interact or don't.
I'll tell
So I
them.
got the last word.
We don't want to argue with that.
We did have a sign-in sheet that you don't have to sign, but in case we do another
3 to 5
event,
years from
we'll
now.
keep your email in our files and we'll email you, so it's right here if you'd like. And please avail yourself of the handouts on your way out. Thank you again.